So the last year, I think the last time that we spoke, we were talking about trees quite a bit. I was getting ready to, I think I was getting ready to open my play Early Morning Song at Red Eye Theater in Minneapolis. And that happened. That has happened since then. That opened in October of 2016 at Red Eye. And that was a play that was dealing with trees. It revolved around a female scientist who studied trees, and she was played by 6 different figures who were all not so much different aspects of her personality, but more 6 different possibilities of who she might have been. I was kind of interested in thinking about kind of all the more obscure figures who are doing research and contributing to our knowledge, who are not necessarily the kind of celebrated figures that we all know about, but the people doing all the work behind the scenes. And so she was one of these figures, and there were 6 different kind of question mark performers representing who she may have been. And she was looking at trees and looking at the end of her life, so kind of facing her own mortality as she's also learning about and reconciling the mortality of kind of human life on the planet. And so that piece had a 3-week run at Red Eye, and was really wonderful to see come to life. We had choreographer Dolo McComb and a musician Skylar Nowinski, who contributed a great deal to kind of the whole voice of the piece. I often think of the text that I write as one component of a much larger whole, not so much a blueprint for what should happen, but one voice in the mix that adds up and accumulates into what the thing is. And so it was text and then a pretty kind of full movement score through the whole piece. It was almost a dance theater piece. And then a sound score that accompanied it, and all directed by Steve Busa at Red Eye. And so that was very exciting. That had been the culmination of a couple of years of work with Red Eye, who commissioned the play. And coming out of that, I went straight down to my hometown of Indiana, my hometown of Vincennes, Indiana, to do a project at the gallery that my parents run actually now, called Art Space Vincennes. And I was collaborating with 3 other Minnesota artists, Liz Miller, David Hamlow, and Theo Goodell, to create kind of a multimedia installation in the gallery that dealt actually with some themes that came out of Early Morning Song, kind of climate change related themes, but this is more in a visual art context. So Liz and David took over the 3 rooms of the gallery with a visual installation. And then Theo and I created sound scores and some live performance for each of the rooms. And it was much more abstract than a play like Early Morning Song, and much more kind of atmospheric. People could wander through all the rooms and experience things on their own time. But definitely kind of had some parallels in terms of the content. And Liz and David in their work were kind of working with organic forms found in the flora and fauna of southern Indiana, and then also with some of the architecture in the kind of main street area where the gallery is located. And then Theo and I were riffing on both of those kind of worlds of content to create some text and sound that created sort of different moods in each of the rooms, thinking about kind of what the future might be like, and kind of how the past and the future and the present are talking to each other, for people in that town, for us as artists coming into that town, for me who has a history in that town, and then for them who had never really spent a lot of time there. So it was kind of a stew of ideas that were percolating in that exhibit. And then I came back to Minnesota, and the election happened, which I think stirred up a lot of reflection and thinking, certainly myself and in my artistic community, about what to do next, and how that development is informing all of our lives on a really personal basis, and in our country on a national basis. So incidentally, I also had a block of kind of open time where I had no deadlines or no immediate projects that had to be put up quickly. So I feel like last winter became a time of a little more reflection, a little more writing in a more unstructured way, where I wasn't writing into a particular project yet, but rather kind of doing some reevaluating and thinking about what might be next. Inevitably, when I have those periods that feel like they're going to be more reflective, they do start to fill up anyway with other smaller projects or smaller things. So by the spring, things were cooking again with a lot of kind of smaller project deadlines. I did some work with Christine Baumler from the University of Minnesota on her backyard phonology project, which again was carrying through some of these themes from Early Morning Song and before. I think this is not just around Early Morning Song. I think a lot of my work in recent years is kind of looking at how my writing and performance practice can keep climate change kind of at the forefront of the conversation, and but getting under the skin of it, like trying to look at how do we talk about this very vast subject. I think a lot of my audiences are people who believe in climate change and recognize that it is an urgent issue, but maybe have periods of feeling paralyzed around what to do or how to respond to it. And of course, it can feel very abstract at moments when you're going about your daily life, and what can you possibly do to make an impact on this like vast problem, right? So I've been doing a lot of writing just into that question with no super useful conclusions per se, but meditating on that question and pushing it around in my work, and trying to make it personal or make it embodied, kind of understand my own body's relationship to this world that it's in. And so for Christine's project, the Backyard Phonology Project is an ongoing project that is has many different facets to it, but one of them being she has collected, together with her whole team, a number of audio interviews with people about changes they've noticed over time in their immediate environments. So anything from, it used to snow here more often and now it seems to be less often, or I used to notice, this sort of insect and I'm not seeing that insect so much anymore, but I am seeing this insect, or these little changes in the environment, which may or may not have any direct relationship to how the environment is shifting with climate change. But as you accumulate those observations over time, you can start making some really interesting, bigger observations, right, about the patterns of nature and how they might be shifting. So I was invited to interact with those audio interviews by kind of arranging the text of some of them. We took some of the interviews and it was so fun. I got to play with the language of the interviews and play with making them into almost, not songs, we didn't set them to music, but maybe poems. Just working with the language of the people who were interviewed, but pulling certain things out, making them repeat, kind of framing things so that they pop in different ways. And then we re-recorded them, still using the original audio, but spliced them together according to these arrangements that I had made. So we had the original audio available on the website, but also this kind of spliced, kind of creatively manipulated audio that was featured kind of within this mobile unit that Christine has designed, and visitors could go inside the unit and listen to these kind of audio poems. And that was at the 2017, what year are we in? 2017 Northern Spark Festival on the university campus. And so that was a really lovely kind of exercise in kind of using some found material, some existing material, some factual material, people's real lived experiences, and thinking about how to arrange those texts that in a way that honors the material and honors the perspectives that are shared, but also helps us hear them in a new way or in an unexpected way, and maybe helps us start imagining or thinking about the content in a new light. So that was really wonderful. And then I ended up spending most of the summer from June to the end of August in New Portland, Maine, where I think I mentioned this last time we spoke as well. My partner's family has a farm there that we are in the very early stages of exploring, turning into some kind of artist retreat residency space. And this summer was our first time just spending a little more than a week or two there to explore what the space could tell us, what happens when we bring other people into the space. We threw a wide net inviting people to come and just stay for a few days to a week to a few weeks, and do, mostly artists came and just worked on projects that they were already working on to test it out. And that space, it was a really beautiful summer of just working there and being with the forest that is on that property. It is mostly forest there. It's about 100 acres of land, mostly forest. And largely I was, doing research about the area and about the space and thinking towards the future of the space. But I did create one project there that was kind of a love letter between Minnesota and Maine. And so it was kind of looking at the flora and fauna of Maine and of Minnesota, which have quite a bit of overlap, actually. And I wrote a text that then a friend here in Minnesota set to music, and we projected the text in the gallery at Silverwood Park. And so the text was kind of scrolling through or really, I shouldn't say scrolling, it was more like a PowerPoint sort of presentation appearing on a screen, and the audience could sit and read it. And then the music was scoring it, and you have, the windows of that space look out on the park around it. So you're kind of surrounded by nature as you're reading. And as part of that project, I also asked, within the text that was shown on the screen, invited people in the gallery to write a postcard to me that they mailed back to Maine. So it's just starting to look at kind of the correspondence between these state lines, which are actually quite arbitrary in a way when you're looking at sort of what they contain, and the overlap between what they contain, and kind of creating a correspondence between people there in Maine and here in Minnesota. And that was just, it was a smaller scale experiment in many ways. I was both kind of experimenting with the format of this screen that where the text, it's almost like a short play, but it's just read. It had kind of a narrative voice or a character behind it, but that might be interpreted slightly differently by different viewers. And for it to exist in this kind of form, that was a really interesting kind of formal experiment, but then also kind of experimenting with, if we continue building this space in Maine, which is still very much in a kind of an early exploratory stage, how can it have meaningful relationships with places outside of it, including the really vibrant community here. So that happened in July. And I was in Maine through the end of August, and then I had the pleasure of spending 4 weeks in residence at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, MassMoCA, in Western Massachusetts, which was just a wonderful experience. Just living in an apartment across the street from the museum and visiting the museum pretty much every day, and I had a little studio on the campus where I could write, and it went by very fast. Just was working away all month, both kind of reflecting on everything that had happened over the summer, and then looking towards some new projects that were percolating for the fall. And one of those projects that happened pretty quickly after I returned was Matthew Jendrzejewski's Arena Dances company premiered a new piece at the Cole Center, the Tech Box at the Cole Center in November, the very beginning of November, so November 1st and 2nd, I think, or 2nd and 3rd. And this is largely a dance piece that Matthew had choreographed, but he had asked me to contribute some text. And so this text was taking both a visual form, in some cases projected behind the dancer on the wall, and then in other cases it was recorded and used more as voiceover. But again, kind of a wonderful experiment in seeing how the language was interacting with these other kind of visual components, including movement, and it was really kind of, it was Matthew's concept and vision, so kind of responding to that and seeing how the text could support what he was creating with the dance. It was a solo for a dancer named Timmy Wagner, who's just incredible. So that was I was writing a lot of that text while I was in residency at the museum, and sort of dove into rehearsals as soon as I returned. And now the kind of next big thing that I'm doing is preparing a project that I actually wrote 2 years ago. It premiered in 2015. It's called In Which Blank and Others Discover the End. It was a collaboration with Supergroup, and it is going to be published in 2018 by a small press called Plays in Verse. And so we are doing some collaborative revisiting of the text. So it's kind of complicated to explain, but I'll try. This piece was a very multidisciplinary collaboration. So Supergroup being kind of rooted in the dance community here, but also having a lot of overlap with theater. And then myself as an experimental playwright. We came together to work on this project, and pretty quickly into it invited installation artist Liz Miller and the art rock band Brute Heart to collaborate with us. So the performance, which happened at Public Functionary Contemporary Gallery in March and April 2015, the performance included, it had a lot of spoken text, a lot of dance, and then a full score by Brute Heart, and it was all happening in this immersive kind of installation that Liz had created. And again, this project is dealing with questions about climate change, and kind of our sort of embodied relationship to it. We were really inspired initially by an essay by Joanna Macy, who talks about the kind of unconscious collective grief that exists unknowingly in a lot of our cases, but is there kind of in our bodies, with this knowledge that there may be a finite limit to the number of generations ahead. And she talks about kind of just acknowledging and process, like moving through that grief. And we were really compelled by that essay, and so the piece was a little bit of a processing of some of her ideas, but then also pulling in some other sources. We worked with a fair amount of found text, some kind of, looking at kind of how our bodies hold knowledge in all kinds of different ways and all kinds of different knowledge. So, looking at kind of, there was a very relatively recent scientific discovery of a new ligament in the knee, and how many times have people looked at the anatomy of the knee, and we think we kind of have it figured out, and then suddenly there's a new ligament in plain sight. So things, the way research is constantly evolving was interesting to us, and kind of our intellectual knowledge of research and our capacity to articulate it, but then also the knowledge that we have that exists in us in a way that is harder to put into words or harder to put into language, but can play a prominent role in how we move through the world anyway. The piece was really grappling with some of those ideas. And so as we created the piece, I was creating a script, and the script had my text, and then it also had kind of placeholder notes for choreography that we were working on together, because I performed in the piece along with Supergroup. And the choreography, it's mostly sort of little one word sort of shorthand, like cosmonauts. We call this section cosmonauts, and it's not because it's about cosmonauts, but that's an easy way for us to remember what that movement is. And so I had a number of just sort of like evocative things peppered like that through the script. And when we started discussing the project with Plays in Verse, the editor there was very interested in kind of how that language sort of resonates already kind of as literature, with kind of a poetic resonance that's, you don't always know what those things mean, but you can imagine different possibilities. But we also started thinking about, what is this piece as, what was it as a performance that existed in this kind of ephemeral form? And then what is it as a book that exists as literature, as something that kind of lives on in this, as an object? And started getting interesting in unpacking some of those prompts, not in great detail and not in any kind of prescriptive way, but starting to unpack like what some of the impulses were behind them, or what the essence of them might be, to give the reader just a little more to chew on, or a little more to move through as they move through the text, and to serve as kind of interesting scores if someone were to ever pick up this text and be interested in making their own production of it. For us, it serves more as an archive of what happened, and not a script that we would probably send around to other theaters proposing they think about producing it. But we're not opposed to that idea. If someone ever picked up the book and wanted to stage it themselves, we're kind of interested in making the book a coherent enough guide for how that could work, or give enough kind of information of the intent behind all the movement and language, and how they work together to enable someone to do that. So that is the process that we are steeped in now, some of that revising. And also we are doing a little bit of editing of some of the found text that we had initially pulled in, just to make sure that we're covering all our bases, and we're seeking permissions in some cases to reprint things, and then in other cases we're replacing it with different material. Because the world of copywriting is a very intriguing and nebulous zone when it comes to creative work like this. So we want to just make sure we're honoring all the text that's part of it, and not using anything we shouldn't. So that is a nice intensive process that will take us into January, and we're hoping the book will be printed and released actually by March or April with the small press world. The deadlines are much tighter and shorter than in larger publishing worlds. So it'll be a pretty quick turnaround. And that is the next big thing. Do you have questions, Peter?
So much. I always go with the most immediate impulse and move on. I have lunch at a place on Sunday with not very good acoustical separation, and I've had 3 pretty interesting plays take place at the next table on 3 different days that I've been there. And I think partly it's because the place where I have lunch is not trendy in any way. It doesn't even look like a restaurant, so people don't think, well, if I go there somebody will see me, they think if we go there, nobody will ever expect us. We'll never meet anybody we know there. But it makes me wonder how you handle found text. Because if I take you to lunch there, you're going to get a play idea. I can pretty much guarantee it.
Yeah. It's a very delicate zone, right? I know lots of playwrights who eavesdrop on public conversations and find useful material in that realm. And I think typically, as long as they're not, identifying this, if it's an overheard conversation by a stranger, and it's not going to, by using the material, it's not going to identify the person. I think often writers will just run with that and riff on that, and probably by the time it becomes a full piece, it's outside any recognition of that original source. It spurs you in all kinds of other directions, And then I know other writers who are very diligent about working, only using material that has explicit permission, and that they're having in more deep conversation with some of these sources, and that starts to get into more kind of documentary theater and or community collaborative theater, or community-based theater, where you're really deliberately kind of culling some stories, but there are really big ethical considerations that you want to be thinking through in how you use those stories and who's involved in that process all along the way. For this particular project with Supergroup, none of the material was culled in quite that manner, so it was all texts that already exist. There's one section of the piece where we were kind of looking at other performances that have grappled with climate change in different ways and taken different approaches to the subject matter. And we weren't using any of that material in our piece, but we were reading critical reviews of those plays and kind of the language that's used to critique those plays artistically and in terms of the content. And so then we were collaging together some of the language from those reviews. And so then when we started thinking about publishing, we were wondering, how much of this, is there a question? Is there, are there permissions needed in certain cases, or is it a new enough thing, that it falls under fair use? And, anyone you ask will give you a different answer, and fair use is a very, very gray area. But we ended up actually rewriting most of that section, in fact, all of that section, to maintain a sense of what it originally was, but to distance it from the original sources, so that now it's more inspired by those sources. It's not quoting those sources anymore. But there are questions like that we've had to ask ourselves all along the way, and each kind of source of inspiration or source of quoting comes with its own set of questions that you need to consider. And there's simply no hard and fast rule for any of it. And I think a lot of it becomes pretty common sense. If you are doing something radically different from what that original text does, it's a better case scenario than if what you're making could replace that other source. That's a problem. Particularly when money is involved, which in our case, I think there won't be much of that.
Scratch that headache.
Small press. Small independent press. But even with that, it's out there in the world, and we certainly don't want to, we certainly want to honor all these sources and cite them as inspirations, but we don't want to be taking material in any way that would make someone unhappy. So we're working through all those questions together and largely rewriting things that we have any question about at all, so that we're not crossing any lines.
Yeah. Well, it's an odd thing to say to somebody, I'm going to make art out of you. And then, and especially it's odd what do you do when they say no.
Yeah.
And sometimes the right answer is, I don't care. But it's not always.
No.
I interview about a month back with a street photographer, author of the book Humans of Minnesota.
Oh, yeah.
And the issue there is people's behavior on the street is fair game. But she would never treat it as fair game.
Yeah.
I mean, feels obliged to get into relationships with the people she photographs and have conversations. They end up friends sometimes, but you know, she doesn't want them to be kind of included as building stones and mortar in her enterprise.
Right. Right.
But then I sit there in this cafe and I listen to maybe the funniest existential conversation I've ever heard. I mean, the conversation that I would have had at 21. And that, you know, every bit of it hurts because I would have had that one at 21. And I know exactly why I don't have it at 66.
Right.
You know, and I mean, you know, if I could bottle it, clean it up just a little bit, it would be the funniest play ever. And so the question is, I mean, to put it real bluntly, do I get to laugh at these guys, given that they aren't doing anything particularly funnier than other 21-year-olds are doing? It's just they are so clearly 21. And so what do I do? And I mean, if I were to say, you know, I'm not a playwright, so I don't have the problem, but if I were to say, you know, I want to take your dialogue more or less verbatim, twist it around a little bit, and turn it into the funniest thing that theater in the round has done in the last 10 years. What would they say?
What would they say? Who knows?
and do I give them the option?
Right.
Because after all, they're just representative 20, you know, they're every 20-year-old.
Right. Well, and that's the thing with some of that material. I think the reason a lot of writers just run with it without, you know, walking up to their table and checking with them is that because it's so familiar in a way, right? It's actually, it's very likely you would hear the same conversation in any number of restaurants among 21-year-olds, potentially, or certain kinds of 21-year-olds. And so, I think there's, you know, it's a fine line between like, okay, that person's turn of phrase was so clever or specific versus like, you know, the ideas that we're discussing here are something, you know, that are so true. They ring true or they ring funny or they ring, you know, they're entertaining because there's a recognition in them of our own thought process of when we were younger or someone else that we know or and so I think material like that you can get away with in a different way because it's not about authorship so much as these kind of truths or these ideas that we can all interact with. If you were using them totally verbatim, I don't know, you know, people have all kinds of different opinions about this. It's like, you know, if you told them you wanted to go write a hit play based on their conversation, they might say, oh, we should do that. And we had the conversation, so that idea is ours, you know. So you know, you never want to assume, I guess, but I know many people take liberties with just running with material like that, and probably those people, if they saw the play, they might not even remember they had that conversation, or they might really recognize themselves in it. And so it's, you know, I think each writer has to kind of look within themselves to make choices about content like that.
Yeah, it's so funny. My cousin Tom McGrath spent a summer interviewing my uncle about the processes of running his farm. And then a couple years later, this stuff showed up in a poem, the hero of which was named Anthony Mechanicus. And it was interesting and powerful to watch the response to, having been made into a poem.
Yeah.
But I want to press on this one for you because there's the old story of Faulkner's acceptance speech for the Nobel where he said, this work has been produced at great cost of time and intelligence to lift up men's minds. And you have this idea, there's this playwright drinking, or the playwright, the author, whatever, drinking heavily, writing long into the night, sending it off to the publisher, the book's there, and then there are the minds on the other side just waiting to be lifted up out of the mud, and it all, that's the way the process is supposed to go. But you mess with that every way you possibly can, with the relationship to the audience, and with the audience as part of the performance, or just sitting there looking at it. You actually, the story you told today sounds like you're in a sort of conservative phase. There's a lot of audience sitting there watching
it's
something.
True.
The postcard is the most interactive thing you describe, but I remember when you were mailing off gifts to, some thousands of people in your neighborhood and asking for postcards back.
Right.
Now, I remember all these things you've done through the years, and your kind of discomfort with the Faulknerian idea of, I work really hard to uplift you people, and by God, you better be uplifted, or tell me why not. What's happening with you and audiences, and you and what's happening with this artist and everybody else thinking, which is, loosened up more when I talk to you than it ever is with anybody else.
Yeah. Well, it's ever on my mind. I think I definitely approach my work less like Faulkner. Less that I have something profound to share with you, and more as sort of an invitation to a conversation, because I'm asking a lot of questions with my work. A lot of playwrights in particular talk about, the story that they want to tell with their plays, and it's all about telling a story. And I really approach my work a little more like asking a question. I'm asking a question with this work, and how that conversation then manifests. It may be as traditional as here's a play on a stage that an audience watches and they go away and discuss the questions themselves, or it may happen, within the performance more directly. And I have been very interested in, for a long time, in kind of exploring the different ways that can happen, but particularly with an eye toward comfortable and consensual ways that can happen. As a relative introvert who does not like to be demanded to participate in things, but is interested in participation. I'm always sensitive to what are ways to let people opt in to engaging, or to let people engage in a multiplicity of different ways. So this year, I've been in a little bit of I had, for maybe 4 years or so, kind of, I had just back to back kind of big project commitments. And then there came this moment of pause where this year I've had a lot of smaller kind of project commitments, but not as many kind of large main stage works in the cooker right now. So that's been nice in terms of rooting a little back into like, okay, what is a writing practice? What is it for me to be at my desk with a notebook or with a computer and writing? Whereas, I've been in this kind of exploded state of rehearsals and, research and all these things with other people quite a bit, it's been nice to kind of just go back for a moment, not forever, but to be like, okay, writing, like, let's revisit what that is. And then, and the Greetings from Maine project, the Maine to Minnesota project, certainly was touched on kind of like, what is the audience relationship to this? It's more like a gallery installation, right? But it was time-based, so it was a performance of sorts, but there were no performing bodies. It was just text and music. And I think I forgot to mention before, the music was by Christina Collins, who also has relationship with the university through the Institute for Advanced Study. And so Christina's music and my text, but like nobody performing, is kind of an odd kind of performance, right? But the audience could, they could come and go. It did repeat a few times, so if they stayed for the whole thing, they'd start noticing things they'd heard already. So it gave them a range of choices in terms of, do I, want to sit with this for a while? Do I want to go walk around? Some of the text prompted them to go outside, and they could choose to stand up and go outside or stay put and see what it said next. And then the postcard writing, was maybe the most kind of active instruction to write something and send it to me. But that, I feel like that was a nice kind of mid-year reconnect with some of these audience experiences. I mean, the Backyard Phonology Project, too, gave people a range of choices for how to engage with the audio material. But with the supergroup book, that's, in some ways, it's a more traditional medium in terms of publishing a book, and it's text, and readers will read it. But we've already greatly confused our publisher, saying that, it's me and this ensemble writing it. So it's not all just by me, it is a collaboration. And so how do you write a contract that's for, Rachel plus a group? And how do you think about, rights and royalties or whatever, like, how do you think about all the ripple effect of doing something as a group versus as, an individual, which is something I really enjoy parsing through, both artistically, how we work together artistically, and then structurally, how we produce, how we administrate, how we make space for collaboration in these structures that are not built for that, typically. Payment structures and on our taxes and all these different places where it plays out. So I kind of consider that, whether it's me and my collaborators or me and audiences, how we're interacting, I'm interested in that whole picture all the way through, from kind of the seedling of the idea to our process of making it to how it's presented, and then both kind of behind the scenes as well as kind of the artistic work that's created from that. I'm always thinking about kind of what that audience role is. But you're right that this year it's a little more, it's not quite as audacious as it sometimes is. It's just a quieter year in some ways, I think, on that front.
It's also a year when you're away more.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly like you're going to run into people on the street who are involved with things you're doing.
Right. Yeah, they were about 4 months away. So that's a big block of time. And it certainly got me thinking about correspondence. I am, another project that I'm kind of starting in 2018 is, there's a theater company called The Syndicate. And if you ask me where they're based, I would say, I don't know, or a lot of places, because they have 8 members who are all geographically dispersed. And so I only know one of them personally, and our conversation is how this project started to form. But I've never met any of the others, and as a way to get to know each other, we've decided to have a letter writing exchange through the mail. So I'm writing them letters and just asking them questions about themselves, and they're responding. And through that exchange, I'm getting to know them, and then we're also starting to develop a bank of content, our kind of handwritten letters, to mine later on, potentially for the piece that we make together. And we're leaving it really open in terms of what the content of the piece might be, but we're talking a lot about kind of our different urban and rural upbringings, different places where we grew up, and kind of the so-called divide between the city and rural communities. Kind of unpacking some of that a bit, and I suspect that will find its way into the piece. But that's an example of a project that I think is, it's coming up in that form because of their situation, but it's also coming up for me in terms of a sense of kind of geographic fluidity that has always been part of my life to some extent, as my family is all in different places, and I've lived in many different places over the years. And I'm here in Minnesota, but I'm connected to these other places. So how those relationships kind of continue to be nurtured across distances is really interesting to me. And how we continue to be learning from other places, like particularly in light of the election, so much conversation about the big divides between city communities and rural communities. And I've become extra interested after growing up in a very rural southern Indiana community, but living in cities most of my adult life, kind of what the conversation is between those realities. And a lot of people who live in cities grew up in rural places, or still have ties to rural places, or have family, and there's plenty of people who grew up in cities who have decided they want to leave the city and have a rural life. And then there's people who have, stayed in one or the other very deliberately, or by circumstance most of their lives. So, so as I think about, this project space in Maine, as I think about my community here, as I think about this collaboration with the syndicate, I'm really interested in kind of how to get those worlds talking to each other more, and some of the modes that, we have social media, we have the internet, a lot can be transferred on these platforms, but a lot can kind of come to a standstill on those platforms too. And of course there's lots of dialogue about how limited the perspectives are that are circulating kind of within one's own Facebook feed, or within one's choice of news outlets. So I'm kind of curious about how to bypass some of that, also get myself offline because my eyes just get tired, and return to, what is it to write a letter and mail it to someone, or what is it to go be outside in some of these different places, and just the live experience. I think I've always been drawn to live performance. I think I'm drawn to live experience because something different happens. But we do live in this very geographically dispersed, technologically driven world now. So I'm not interested in eschewing that altogether and ignoring it, or not making use of it. But in the face of that, I'm kind of curious about how to be integrating. Not forget about the live experiences, not let them fall to the wayside, and see what they can borrow from, what they can usefully borrow from the technological tools we have available, but then how can we also reground ourselves in our own bodies and not forget that they are there and a resource. That's something I'm thinking about a lot these days.
Well, you returned to southern Indiana. That was a big deal.
Yeah.
How was that?
Yeah, that was a big deal, because I go home on a pretty regular basis to visit family, but that was the first time I brought a project to my hometown. And it was a pretty strange project to bring, It's one thing if I came back as a playwright and brought a play and it was in a theater and people would know kind of how to interact with that. I grew up, doing theater in high school, so people in my community kind of knew me through that lens. But here I was in this gallery space, with all these other artists, with this kind of walk-through installation. That was kind of out there, and overall it was a wonderful experience. It was really fun, and it was well received, and I think part of that is like much credit is due to my parents who run the gallery, and they're both retired art professors, and so through the gallery they still have a teaching practice. You know, they're contextualizing all the exhibits. They're offering up, you know, if you've never spent that much time with contemporary art, here are some things to consider, you know, just as you look at it, you know, ways to kind of invite people to have their own experience of it without feeling like, oh, there's something I'm supposed to get that's like the right thing and the wrong thing. They've been really thoughtful about kind of how to frame up everything they're showing. And that's partly through kind of writings that they do. They send out a newsletter, they post things on social media, but then also at the gallery, they are always there talking with people and kind of welcoming them into the space and helping them get a lay of the land. So I think with this project in particular, because they had never done anything like this at the gallery either. Mostly they've shown either 2D, you know, paintings or photographs or sculpture, you know, 3D sculptures, and they hadn't done anything installation or performance based in this way. I mean, they'd done some kind of performances that were like single night events, but nothing that was immersive in the gallery space. So, you know, we had all kinds of responses. We had people coming through that just loved it and, you know, thought it was this kind of magical space that was thought-provoking. We had other people come through and, you know, it reminded them of a haunted house or of some other kind of immersive experience they'd had. I had, you know, old school teachers as I was performing say, "Hi, Rachel." All kinds of experiences. But I think overall, I feel like it was successful in creating a sense of imagination and expansion, and that was something we kind of settled on as we were thinking about kind of what kind of piece we wanted to put in that space. And this is something I come back to a lot in my work and write about a lot in kind of my artist statements. Creating, you know, exercising the imagination, just creating a space where that is encouraged, because so often we're kind of moving through these systems and through our jobs or through our lives, and there's so much kind of right and wrong, or this is how this works, or this is how this doesn't work. And we can go for a long time, I think, if we're not actively making an effort, we can go for a long time without really working those muscles of imagination. And we do it, you know, people find all kinds of outlets to do that, but I'm really interested in creating more opportunities for that, more spaces that are inviting people to have a new experience, or a mysterious experience, or a beautiful experience, or a strange experience, you know, whatever kind it might be, but one that really activates the imagination and gets them thinking in a way that maybe they haven't done before or haven't done in a while, or so imagining, you know, both possibilities of what they're experiencing and then possibilities of what can be. And I think those same muscles are the ones that we use to then imagine things like, how could my life look different? Or like, what other job could I work that would make me happier? Or what other, you know, system could work for us economically? Or, you know, it can scale up in many ways, but a small practice even of going to a performance or reading a book and imagining these other worlds or these other meanings, I think can help stimulate some of that ripple effect. So I feel like that was a dynamic that existed in that space for that time we were in there. It's hard to say what any one person took away. We've had some anecdotal conversations and some good feedback kind of through the guest book and things like that. But you never know really how these things sit with people over time. But it was very satisfying. It was very satisfying to do as kind of my first re-entry back. It felt more honest in a way than if I just brought a proper play.
Yes, the proper play. Well, one thing I know about going to small places is that there are going to be a great many audience members who do something that isn't art most of their lives.
Yeah.
And a few people who do art every possible moment they can and are feeling terribly out of place among the Toro employees. Or maybe they are Toro employees, but they're really mostly artists. And they come to your thing because an animal of their species has just arrived at the zoo. How's that conversation?
Yeah, well that, I've been so happy and impressed to see this gallery that my parents have been running there for almost 5 years now, because I think it's a home exactly for, it serves all kinds of functions and brings all kinds of people through its doors, but I think particularly for people who are in a smaller community and don't necessarily feel like they have as many resources, to arts organizations or places where they can see work or practice. I think it's been really important in that sense for as a hub where people can come and see different work by different artists and have these conversations and feel connected in that way. And I think that some of those people certainly, it's interesting kind of looking back now. I could probably point to some specific people that seeing a show like that was probably really important for them. And I think back to when I was young and my parents both being artists themselves, I probably got a little more arts exposure than other people, but there were plenty of things in kind of the theater and performance world that I didn't have any exposure to until I left that town, until I went to college. And I often wonder, what would that have been like to encounter this work that I didn't encounter until I was 25 or even 30, what would it have been like to encounter that work as a teenager or, while I was still in that town. And to be able to bring something that I certainly never experienced anything like it growing up, to be able to bring that that kind of work into that space was really fun. And who knows, I don't presume it's hard to know, like, what if it changed anyone's life or made someone think about creating that kind of work themselves. But I think the more access to ideas and the more access to different forms of creativity, the better for anyone. So that was really edifying to be able to bring a project back that was really both an exciting artistic experience for me now where I'm at, and an exciting thought to be able to bring a kind of work that is pretty underrepresented, I would say, in that region.
No reason you should have, but did you actually have the thought that you were communicating to yourself at 14?
That's interesting. Maybe in more of a subliminal way. I don't think I had that active thought so much, but there were certainly things in that piece that were kind of layers of my childhood embedded within, as we were looking at the architecture of the town and the flora and fauna of the town through the kind of visual components. And then as I was like riffing on that to think about language together with Theo, a lot of childhood memories were coming up and weaving their way into the text. And I think there's certainly some kind of channeling or conversation that was happening between the past and the present and the potential future. That was very personal.